This is Chapter 4, Part 3. We left off last time talking about sort of different kinds of agents of social control. We talked about agents of ideological social control, and now we see agents of direct control. And what they mean by that is an example would be a police officer who gives you orders about how you should behave, what you should do, how you should comply in a situation, in a scene where there's contact between police and citizens. And he's not going to be an ideological sort of agent of social control where he's teaching you big picture and teaching you these values and rules about proper behavior in a big context. He's just going to want to handle the situation, and if you're not compliant with his orders, that sort of thing, then there's going to be problems. And so that's direct. An example where someone is using direct authority to control other people's behavior. So the main idea there is that we're not teaching you right and wrong, and definitely not the big picture. Is just I'm using the authority I have right now to control the immediate situation or to try to influence your behavior in the here and now. Now, Donald Black is an important writer in the area of criminology, and he is a sociologist. He talks about 4 types of formal social control, and recall that that's social control from an authority. And it applies very much to the legal system, to the criminal justice system. He starts out with the most severe, harsh form of social control, which he calls penal control. And penal control sees the deviant as an offender who deserves punishment. So the criminal law tends to take a penal approach, which is it's dealing with behavior that the state, the government, thinks is serious enough that we need to criminalize it, we need to punish it if you're convicted of committing these illegal acts. And so the way, the method that's used to try to control your behavior is pretty severe. Penal, meaning we'll lock you up, we'll or at a lower level, we'll fine you, we'll charge you money, but the focus is on punishment. Penal, that word refers to punishment. Compensatory is a step less severe, and in this case, victims of deviance should be compensated. So this applies more to civil law. We'll talk about criminal versus civil law in a future chapter, but just suffice it to say right now that with civil law, the idea is that we need to compensate the victim. It's not so much about punishing the offender, it's about getting justice, getting compensation for the victim. So you sue somebody, you win in a court of law, and you're awarded a certain number of dollars as compensation for the wrong that you have suffered as the court sees it. So compensation, compensatory, less severe than penal. The next, even milder form of social control is conciliatory. It sees deviance as a conflict that must be resolved. So here you don't really see so much as one party being guilty and one being innocent. You don't really see offender and victim. It's 2 parties that have a conflict, 2 groups that have a conflict with each other, and they're not able to resolve it themselves. They need an outside party, and so you can have authorities come in, mediators who can come in, who can hear both sides, and who can come up with some sort of compromise or some sort of resolution that hopefully the 2 sides can live with. So that's again is softer than compensatory, because you don't see people as guilty versus innocent, but rather just having competing interests that need to be somehow resolved. Finally, the mildest form of formal social control, according to Black, is therapeutic. And here you see deviance as an illness, as a something is not right with the person who's acting in a deviant way. And so what they need is not punishment. What they need is help. They need to be treated. So you look at them as being sick, as ill, as people in need of treatment. you treat them like a patient. And so you apply medical techniques, therapeutic techniques. And so it's a form of helping. It's considered and looked at as a form of helping, not a form of punishment, but as a form of helping. And so this one would be seen as the mildest, and I suppose you could say the most positive of these four types of formal social control. Now, according to Black, less informal social control leads to more formal social control. So let's bring this down and make it more concrete with the example of crime. Black would say that if you don't have a strong society where people informally have a lot of influence on each other, your peers don't really have any say or any influence on your behavior, the people, just ordinary people, really don't have much influence on your behavior, then we end up falling back as sort of a last resort to using formal social control, the severe stuff, the criminal justice system. So Black's idea is that we fall back and we rely on the criminal justice system more and more and more as society gets weaker and weaker, and we're not able to influence our friends and neighbors through just informal means, through talking, through friendships, through disapproval of deviant behavior, of criminal behavior. And so when that falls through, Black says the society would probably prefer to be able to handle its deviant behavior in an informal way because it's less severe. But that if that falls through and it's not working, then we have to turn to the police. We have to turn to the courts and to the jails and prisons as sort of a last resort because we feel like there's no other way to handle this problem of criminal behavior, right? So remember that less informal social ties, he would say you're going to end up having a bigger criminal justice system, more punishments as a result. He would also say that formal social control is going to be used more in societies that are big, large, complex, more stratified, meaning that you have more inequality. There's a bigger gap, a bigger distance between the people at the top of society and the people at the very bottom. So if you have a very unequal society, you're going to get more formal social control. And also if you have a more heterogeneous society, which is, a fancy way of saying diverse society. So if your society, so what he would say is you're going to have a big criminal justice system if your society is very large, very unequal, very complex, very diverse. That it gets to be sort of such a huge deal that the informal ways of handling problem behavior don't work as well. And we end up falling back on relying on the criminal justice system to handle a lot of our problems. And that's especially true in these, so remember those characteristics: big, complex, stratified, diverse, that you end up tending to get a larger, more involved criminal justice system, according to Black. So again, some interesting ideas from this sociologist. Now, the medical model of deviance goes along with this therapeutic view we just talked about a moment ago. Deviance is understood as an illness that should be treated medically. Let me move to the next slide here. This view is the opposite of the philosophy taken normally by the criminal justice system, that behavior is freely chosen. So the traditional criminal justice system looks at crime as a freely chosen behavior that deserves accountability, that deserves punishment, that the individuals need to take responsibility for their behavior and pay their debt to society. That's the traditional criminal justice view. The medical view sees people in general, sees criminals in particular here specifically as people who, if they're not behaving properly, if they're not conforming themselves to the laws of society, then they're broken somehow. Something's not working right. The brain is not functioning correctly. Something you look at, the medical model sees people as being, patients, being like organisms that have to be treated, that there's something malfunctioning in the organism and we need to come in and repair it and restore normal behavior. So that's a very different view. It's not a free one, a free will one like the traditional view of the criminal justice system. it sees the criminal as sort of, it's the disease that's driving his or her behavior. It's not their choice. So it's a somewhat controversial is maybe a strong term, but it's a disagreed upon point of view because people, not everybody's comfortable seeing criminals as not being responsible for their behavior, but seeing them instead as having some illness that's driving their criminality. Now, the chapter gets into, along with this discussion of medical model of deviance, gets into a very important issue in the criminal justice system, the issue of insanity. This is a legal defense that refers to the defendant's state of mind at the time of the criminal offense. So legally speaking, the question of whether somebody was insane or not when they committed the crime, the question specifically is, were they insane, mentally insane at the moment that they committed the crime? Not before, not after, not now, but at the moment they committed the crime. So it's a legal defense that's used to say that the person's not responsible for their crime because of a mental insanity that at least was present when the crime was committed. Now, here's an important distinction that you may not be aware of. Insanity is a legal term. Whether a defendant is deemed, judged insane or not in the legal system is not something that's decided by a doctor. It's not decided by a psychiatrist or a psychologist. It's decided by the judge or the jury, whoever is deciding the case. Because, you have some trials that are tried by a judge. The judge decides guilt or innocent. Other trials where the jury, a panel of, say, 12 people, decide guilt or innocence. It's these individuals who listen to psychiatrists, who listen to both sides and decide whether, legally speaking, the defendant is insane or not. So it's not the decision that's made by psychiatrists, by medical professionals. It's the judge or the jury. Now, you could agree with that, you could disagree with that, but that's the way it is. Now, some of these, there's a lot of subtleties about what constitutes insanity and all of that from state to state. But this is true, though. This is a legal decision that's made by a judge or the jury. Someone found not guilty by reason of insanity will typically be committed to a psychiatric hospital until deemed to be no threat to themselves or the community. So here we see therapeutic control. So you might, if you didn't know any better, you might think if someone was found to be not guilty because they were insane when they committed the crime, and so therefore not responsible for it, you might think that if they were found that this is what the finding was, that they'd be sent home. Well, you're not guilty, you're not responsible for the crime, so you're free to go. No, it doesn't work like that. Because you've been judged to be insane, typically what happens when you're found not guilty by reason of insanity is that you will be committed to a psychiatric hospital, which sort of functions a little bit like a prison. It's lower security than a prison, but you're not free to go. You are confined to that hospital and you must stay there, and it has a certain amount of security that will prevent you from escaping. And you need to stay there until you are judged, typically by a judge, that you are deemed no longer a threat to yourselves or the community because you are now healed and no longer insane. But as long as the professionals, the judge sees you as still being insane and therefore posing a threat to yourself and others in the community, you will stay confined to that psychiatric hospital. And a lot of times people who are found not guilty by reason of insanity, they actually stay institutionalized, locked up, longer than somebody who just serves a prison sentence. They'll stay in a hospital for years and years and years and years. Now it's a little bit nicer facility and not as severe as a prison, but you're still locked up, and you could be locked up for a longer period of time in the hospital than if you had just been found guilty but you were sane, right, and spent time in a jail or prison instead. So that's one thing you need to keep in mind. It's sort of an interesting twist about this therapeutic approach is that the motivation is to help the defendant, but the way the defendant experiences this quote unquote help, the defendants often experiences it as punishment, as control. If you're locked up in a hospital for years, you may not see that as help. You may very well see that as punishment, not too much different than prison. So that's the darker side, if you want to think of it that way, of this therapeutic control. Is the motivation is to help, but it's a lot like punishment. It's a lot like any other kind of control where you're locked up and your freedom is taken from you, right? So that's an important thing to understand. Very often this is the case with helping. A lot of times helping people who have problems involves controlling them, which complicates the issue a lot. So their confinement in a hospital is often longer than a criminal conviction. So I've already mentioned this, kind of an ironic thing about this fact. Insanity does not work well with our traditional thinking about punishment of criminals. Why seek retribution or try to deter a criminal of future criminal behavior if the person's not in control of his or her behavior, right? So this is a real disconnect, a difference of philosophy that we see within the criminal justice system. On the one hand, are they free as a person in charge and control of their behavior and therefore responsible for it? Or are they sick, ill, suffering from some mental disease that takes over them and they don't have control of their behavior? So this is again a sort of a tension, a disconnect that you see within the criminal justice system. Let's stop there.